Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Lively Faith podcast. I am your host, the Reverend Nathan Stomberg. I'm the rector of Holy Communion Anglican Church in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, and I'm joined here today by my two co-hosts. I have to my left the Reverend Mark Galloway, who is a bishop retired, and to my right, Subdeacon Corey DuPont of St. Mary's. So we'll go ahead and get started here, and let's just get to know each other a little bit better. So I'll go first. I am born and raised West Greenwich, Rhode Island, and I am trained as an engineer at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And just recently, although I guess but only a few years ago now, the time sure flies. We're coming up on 2 years since my ordination.
It's amazing.
As a rector at Holy Communion. It really is. And I never would have expected it to go by this fast, but really a cradle Anglican, we could say, of course, Episcopalian, and that's a conversation for another day.
Right.
And currently, again, serving as the rector, proudly and humbly, of our small congregation. Mark, care to share a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a native Rhode Islander too. I grew up, I'm a country boy, grew up in Exeter. I was born in 1964. It was one of the most rural and poorest places in the state, and it's had a bit of a transformation in these last 58 years, but much of what I'm about comes from my heritage and the place where I was born. And I've been in the ordained ministry almost 30 years now, and have served as a deacon, a priest, in the office of a bishop. And I'm really glad to be part of this conversation, this ministry. I think at this point in my life, it's something I've been looking for, that I can make contributions in ways that I feel I've been on the shelf for a while because of health and all the different circumstances going on in our country. So I'm grateful to be here, and knowing you guys as well as I do, it's an honor to be able to share this time with you.
Yeah, we're grateful to have you.
Yeah, thanks.
How about you, Corey?
Well, I'm a lifelong Rhode Islander, born in Providence, lived in Warwick most of my life, moved a little bit here and there. A suburbanite in every single way, for better or for worse, right? And I'm a member of the Orthodox Church. My parish is in Pawtucket, and trying to pursue ordination. So God willing, we'll see what happens in that regard. So I'm married, I have 3 kids, and not too many complaints. So
God is good.
Yes.
Yeah, I suppose I should mention my better half. I've been married for 35 years. I have 4 children, 3 biological, 1 adopted, 3 grandchildren. They're all adults now, not the grandchildren. Oldest is 13, the grandchildren. My wife's been a stalwart in my life, foundational to who I am. We actually began dating in high school.
Wow.
And when we were 17 years old, so 41 years of my life, of my 58 years, she's been by my side, and she is the chair of the School of Nursing at Rhode Island College, a very busy woman, but just a godly woman, and has been just a wonderful helpmate to me, in both in life and ministry. So I'm very grateful.
I think that's a commonality to the 3 of us. I'd be remiss if I did not mention my own wife, who we recently happily celebrated our 3rd anniversary in September. So similar to my time in ministry, time as a married man has also begun to speed up very quickly.
Yes. Yeah.
And she is absolutely my rock and my companion, formed perfectly by God, only for me. And I would not be here without her and her love and support, and her fellowship as well as a fellow engineer. Really can't say enough good things about her.
She's a lovely young lady.
So, enough about us, for now anyway. One thing that our listeners may be wondering is Lively Faith. What is Lively Faith? What are we doing here? And what's the purpose of this podcast? So I think it's useful for us to discuss that and reflect on it. And I think I'll start. When we were planning out this podcast, I laid out our vision, and what viewers or listeners will likely see as our tagline is this: we discuss difficult questions about how to faithfully live and defend a Christian worldview by leaning on the collective wisdom of the universal church throughout the ages. And as we just mentioned, we all come from a Rhode Island background, so we have a specific Rhode Island flavor, but these principles and the things that I think we will discuss in the coming weeks and months and beyond are applicable beyond the Rhode Island context as well. But lively faith, Mark, can you speak a little bit to lively faith and where that comes from?
Well, in Anglican heritage, lively faith is a term that is attributed. I'm not sure if he's exactly the originator of the term, but Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who is the martyred Archbishop of Canterbury in the 16th century, when he was compiling really the foundational book of Anglicanism, the Book of Common Prayer in its original versions, spoke about faith as being lively faith. And at the time of the Reformation controversy, having that qualifier, lively faith, was very important to Anglicanism at the time, but certainly as it's been played out through history, to distinguish it from continental Protestantism, particularly Calvinism coming out of Geneva with John Calvin, and in parts of Lutheranism, which at times, in a big word, could have a tendency to be antinomian. Mm-hmm. That is, it downplayed the necessity of good works because of its emphasis that you're justified by grace and faith alone. And Anglicanism has been a more eclectic and comprehensive understanding of the economy of salvation, in the sense that a lively faith is, as the book of James would say, right? Faith without works is a dead faith. And there's much controversy at the Reformation about that. So I think it's in great continuity with the word we like to use, the great tradition of the church, which much of which is shared with the glorious tradition of orthodoxy and really our parent, the Roman Church, and ourselves, and the Anglican tradition, that without lively faith, we can't effectively share the gospel to a broken world. Otherwise, you're just talking words and babble or theological jargon to people, right? We have to be able to live our faith so that we give witness in an evangelical sense by how we behave, what we say, what we don't say, what we do, what we don't do. And again, these are such important concepts, lively faith in our case, that seems to be lost in so much contemporary theological discussions, that it has skewed what people think Christianity is. And so progressive forms of Protestantism are completely off their mooring when it comes to these things.
Yeah, and I think in a popular context too, it comes back to the idea that all I need is my personal relationship with Jesus. And that's not to say your personal relationship with Jesus isn't important, but our faith encompasses so much more than that. And if you reduce it down to this one idea of just how you feel about Jesus on the inside, and perhaps whatever your thought life is about him, then there's really no impetus or drive to live that faith out in the world. And certainly there's no practicum associated with it, no sort of moral theology, because it allows you to essentially mold and morph God and Jesus Christ into whatever is most agreeable for your mindset. And I think that's the real danger with that.
It certainly is. It really makes the church unnecessary.
Right.
This idea that the church is our mother, right, as the great patristic fathers would tell us, and that we're children of Mother Church.
Right.
And as I like to point out to some of our brethren, St. Paul makes it clear, the church is the ground and pillar of truth. The church. So from the earliest generations, it was the church that was the deposit of truth, immutable truth, the kerygma, as scholars say, the essence of the gospel that leads to the salvation of mankind.
And I'll interrupt you once more. I think what you're really saying here is that one of the driving forces behind our worldview and our perspectives on this podcast is that the teaching and the traditions of the universal church, the great traditions, as we were just discussing, is really so much more than the popular idea of, well, I don't need the church. The church is full of hypocrites. It's really just about me and God. And without that, like you said, Mark, you become totally unmoored. And I think I'd like to hear your perspective too, Corey, because as we alluded to, we've got both sides of the river here, east and west, and surely Orthodoxy has its own flavor of this as well.
Yes. The Bosphorus, right? Not the Tiber.
Right, right. The other river.
So the other river, a little farther east.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think from an Orthodox perspective, if an Orthodox Christian were to answer that question, I think the ideal response would be in accordance with the Orthodox saints and with many theologians, the great theologians, is that a lively faith is living what they would call an ecclesial life, right? A life in the church, right? It's not a churchless Christianity, right? It's a life that you live in communion with your fellow baptized. It's a life you live in communion with the hierarchy of the church, of course. We may use language like that today and look at it pejoratively, right? And think that, well, that just sounds so cold and callous.
Yeah.
But it's really not, though, right? That is, in the truest sense, what the church is, right? And we live in communion with one another in our participation in the mysteries of the church, baptism, Eucharist, of course, and the other sacraments. But you would certainly, I think, see from an Eastern Christian perspective less emphasis upon the individual suppositions of what it means to be a Christian and more on the communal. So, yeah.
I think that's a really great way of putting it, and kind of twist the glass a little bit too. And I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole here, but it really does call us back to these earlier forms of Christianity, especially pre-Protestant Revolution, and especially now in our own cultural context, where the Christian faith has largely been Americanized, and you have this focus on rugged individualism in your own personal faith versus the necessity of living and existing in church community, which is what God has made us for.
Yes.
I think, Nathan, that's just so important. And it's difficult to have this conversation without coming off as being pejorative about brothers and sisters in Christ that we love from evangelical strands of Christianity. But that Americans didn't invent Christianity. And there's just
Even Jesus wasn't a Republican.
right, or that that the church existed long before the Reformation. It certainly existed long before the first revival in America and the Second Great Awakening and all of these things. And you have a really truncated view of what Christ, the incarnate God's plan for humanity was. If you're going to begin your understanding of the church with Luther's tacking his theses to the door, or Wittenberg, or with Calvin Institutes or the English Reformation or the divide in 1054 between East and West. It's all a misconception of the church's flow through time and space, and that the bride of Christ is the most important thing to the triune Godhead on earth. And Americanism just has been devastating to the concept of what the church is. And there's few of us who can and are willing to speak to that, right? Because it doesn't sell. It doesn't sell. It's not what's going to come bring people in for, I would argue, more entertainment than they are becoming true disciples of Christ, catechized believers of the truth of the great tradition of the church.
I think that's really well said. And just to add, that's obviously going to be a tough pill to swallow. I think even for the three of us, we get caught up in that mindset of an Americanized, individualized Christianity. But it just occurred to me, too, that this perspective should really be a comfort, especially right now as we struggle with what the future of our country is going to look like. Mm-hmm. But it's important for us to remember that the Christian church existed long before the foundation of the United States, and it will exist long after, indeed, until the end of the age. And
we
take great comfort in that.
We just celebrated the feast of Saint Ignatius of Antioch recently. Who wrote the most important literature outside of the New Testament. 7 letters to churches. He died in about the year 107, and already in Ignatius's life, he's like the first superstar of the Christian life, right? We know his story. He's being dragged by the authorities all around the empire, and you're thinking, as we show these upstart Christians that this is what happens to you if you go against Roman authority. We're going to drag him through all these ports, and that's going to dissuade these people from wanting to follow Christ. And instead, he really just creates this massive following, and he willingly dies in the amphitheater. And but already by his lifetime, some 70 years after the resurrection of Jesus, the sacraments are firmly established, the nature of the church. He uses the word he's the first one that we know of to use the word universal Catholic for the church. These are the things that are utterly lost to the vast majority, not only people within our two traditions and our sisters and brothers in the Roman Church, but it doesn't even register within most of the Protestant world of how significant and how awesome is the patristic origins and sustaining power of the Holy Spirit through the early church.
Even beyond Americanism, right? Because you have to look at the roots of Americanism and the roots of America itself, right? Which is the Enlightenment, right? You look at the Enlightenment, which of course is outside and prior to the founding of the United States, right? It's a European movement. So if you look at it from that perspective, there are some there's some nascent aspects of even the United States which we love, right? As a country, it's our home. But we also recognize too that there is a certain anti-Christian, I would even argue, aspect to many of our best institutions, right? You think of, for example, how much, whether it's formal or it's informal, this strict separation that allegedly exists between church and state, right? It's very new and recent in history, and it starts here first, right? It starts here. And I think that's something as Christians in America, irrespective of whatever church we may be a part of, it's a heritage and a legacy that we're very uncomfortable with owning.
Yeah.
Right? Because we love our founding fathers, for example, but at the same time, I think we would take some umbrage with, for example, the fact that, say, Thomas Jefferson went ahead and completely gutted the New Testament and the Gospels, right? But at the same time, we also love so much of what he had to say about representative government and so on, right? That's our legacy, right? That is the American tradition, right? And then Christianity has to find its way within this tradition. So, yes.
Is it?
Right, and the sequential origin of America is so important in that interpretation. So America overwhelmingly is found by Protestant descent.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right, so it's dissenting against the Anglican establishment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think lots of people think, oh, the early colonies were dominated by Anglicanism and subsequently early America. That's just not true.
Yeah.
Right, and so there's this dissent not against the state church of England, but that does infect the whole American Enlightenment attitude as all the dominoes fall. You and I have talked about this many times. America is still the freest, the most powerful, the richest country in the world, and that comes from all kinds of opportunities of the genius of the founding fathers. But Corey's right, exactly right, that this idea of absolute separation of church and state isn't even really what was intended. It's the outcome of the American experience.
And it's a great misconception, too, that people think it's a part of the Constitution, which it was not.
Yeah.
It was just, that was coined by Jefferson, correct?
Right.
So,
Yeah, and is, inadvertently in a letter to some Baptists in Connecticut, and all of a sudden it becomes like it's been codified into American law, LORE, that, it's...
It's an amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah, it's like in the Bill of Rights or something, right? Most Americans couldn't tell you what's in the Bill of Rights, but by golly, they think that is.
Exactly. I think that's part of a wider conversation that we've had before, this idea of myth in American experience and in Christian experience versus being able to develop an intellectual honesty that allows you to engage with history as it is, both the good and the bad, and that you don't idolize the good, which is rightfully captured in the myths that we have about our American heroes, but at the same time, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater when we speak of difficult things and tragedies within history, that we're dealing with real fallen human beings. And I think just tying that in, I guess, as a broader idea that I think will get covered and that we want to be able to bring as a perspective with this show.
Yeah, we're living through it, right? We're living through, so, we're three different generations, literally boom, 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 3 generations. So for me growing up, every classroom, and I grew up in the same district as you did, but there was a picture of Lincoln and Washington in every classroom that I grew up in. Mm-hmm. Right? And so we had a mythical view that was wrapped around a historical view that got interpreted in a way that gave the best light to Washington and Lincoln, right? Yeah. The quality of Washington and Lincoln as absolutely unique people in human history speak for themselves, but we needed to bring in myth, right? Lincoln's almost a deity, right? So if you look at art coming out of the post-Civil War era, he's ascending to heaven, right? And Washington too was interpreted that way. So we've gone from that, me going to grade school in the late 60s through the 70s to today, where we getting rid of the names of the 2 greatest presidents in American history off the elementary schools and high schools and tearing down their statues and all of these things, right? So this dichotomy, this social civil war that's going on about Americans' origins and her development is just festering at a level unprecedented in our lifetimes and in the history of the country, even beyond the Civil War, I would argue. And that the 3 of us, as so many of, hopefully people are going to be listening to us in our efforts to try to be accurate and eloquent about this, are very frustrated and aren't sure what direction to take this information.
Yeah, and you mentioned that dichotomy too. I think a lot of us can relate with wrestling with that, especially within our own congregations and circles beyond that, where on the one hand, you've got our reaction, or the cultural reaction to these myths about American history that have been carried forward as part of our tradition. Things like Abraham Lincoln that you just discussed, or we give the example of George Washington tossing a coin across the Potomac, and that
He had a great arm.
He had a great arm.
Chopping down a cherry tree where cherry trees actually don't grow.
Exactly.
In Virginia. Right.
He was a real Nolan Ryan.
And other than Jesus and maybe the Blessed Virgin Mary never told a lie.
Yes. So you've got those things on the one hand, which I think, especially in a lot of conservative Christian circles, we idolize that image, and when we are confronted with information, historical information about the fact that, well, Washington and Jefferson, they weren't perfect Baptists or Episcopalians or Anglicans, just, again, not historically accurate, but to give it as an example.
Yeah.
We wrestle with the fact that, well, they weren't perfect Christians after all, and they weren't just founding the country solely as a Christian nation. It was a Judeo-Christian background, but
It's a totally new experiment.
it's a totally new experiment, exactly. But at the same time, we've got that and the backlash to the culture at large now wants to throw all of that out, including those Judeo-Christian roots.
Yeah. There's a certain irrationality to it. But some years back when all this began, when they began going after statues and other such public monuments, it was so out of control that even in Massachusetts, for example, they were going after an effigy of the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts, which was an all-black regiment during the Civil War, and they had to take that down too, because that in itself has become a symbol allegedly of oppression, right? It's ridiculous, of course, because it should be one of the milestones, right, of the Black American experience in this country, right? Fighting for your own freedom, right, in the Civil War. But it doesn't have to make sense. None of it makes any sense anymore.
No, but it's still selective, isn't it? I wrote a paper, and several scholars have written about it, but about Chief Seattle, right? Obviously, the city is named after him, and there's a great statue of him in the city. And in context, Seattle was a great man. But in accruing his power, he literally eradicated his other Native American competition, genocide, quite frankly, and also owned slaves, black slaves, that served his confederation of Native Americans. But nobody's tearing down Chief Seattle's statue. It's never going to happen, right? And that's the hypocrisy of the whole thing. And we can't, we endlessly want to project our values. I wouldn't say our three values, but being collective, what's currently going on in America, a contemporary value back onto people who lived in completely different contexts and cultures. It's beyond illogical and silly, right? There are no perfect people. Right? We already mentioned it's a very small pool in human history, and it just boggles my mind, people who live this perspective, but especially people who claim to be followers of Jesus Christ in the contemporary setting, who buy into this, and it's just so destructive.
We of all people should understand the realities of human nature and sin.
Yep.
Well, so many rabbit holes that you could go down. We all know, as people who work in ecclesiastical function in churches, is that the average American doesn't know what original sin is and doesn't believe in it. And certainly doesn't believe it affects their behavior.
Yes.
Right? It's not part of their theological DNA whatsoever. And if you start at that point, you're never going to get to the right place in your understanding of what's wrong with human nature. So your solutions will always be wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Garbage in, garbage out,
Yeah.
as they say.
Yes.
I think that's a good point to transition. We're talking about ideas and the conflict of ideas, and we've been speaking to it more broadly on kind of an American United States level. Let's bring it down to Rhode Island now, and the three of us here, different generations, by God's providence, we've now come together around this little table to talk about various issues. Coming from these different generations, we're going to have different perspectives as well. So I think it would be helpful for us to go over what we see as these generational challenges, these ministry challenges, from the perspective of each of our three generations. And of course, Corey and I, being deferential and humble, will allow our elder statesman, Reverend Galloway, to go first as our
good to be here.
resident baby boomer.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, I won the last year of the boomers, so in '64. As we were talking before we went on air, Rhode Island is utterly unique in its socio-demographics and in its post-Civil War history of any other state in the United States. First, we're a city-state, right? We're only 35 by 50 miles, right? Delaware is just a little bigger than us, right? In modern Rhode Island, from the turn of the 20th century on, is utterly influenced by Catholic immigration. Catholics of all different European nationalities, but predominantly Italian and Irish, came to dominate the socio-political and economic landscape, especially the metropolitan areas in Rhode Island, and then end up dominating both the political system at the local level and law enforcement. And meanwhile, the English, who had been here for centuries, still owned the land, had the money, and employed everybody, right? And so Rhode Island politics and the role of the church, this is slightly not the case anymore, but for a long time, decade after decade after decade, Rhode Island was the most Catholic state in the country in just its population. And so the church had influence on a city-state in Rhode Island like no other place in the world. I mean, the only thing that would be comparable would be the parishes in Louisiana, perhaps.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And so if you were a Protestant growing up in Rhode Island, you tended not to live in Cranston or Providence or Woonsocket. You
Yes.
lived on the fringe areas of, which we would now call South County or Foster, Gloucester, or out near the Connecticut border. And so that's where Baptists and other non-Catholics would be thriving. And the Cold War between those entities was massive. We really can't even imagine it anymore. It was just beginning to thaw when I was a boy. You grew up when it didn't really exist.
No.
So my experience growing up in Exeter, my mother grew up, she moved with her parents to Exeter in 1942. They were French. My grandfather was from Quebec, his family, French Canadians. They were the only Catholics on the road. And at the time, Exeter was, this very rural. The road was dirt. They had 4 one-room schoolhouses in the town that did not have running water or electricity. This is only in the 1940s, and she went to that schoolhouse till 1956. But they were the only Catholic family in their school, as opposed if you grew up in South Providence, there wouldn't have been any Protestants in your neighborhood virtually, right? And my mother and my aunt, there's only 2 kids, my Aunt Jackie, they were shaped by this. They were told by their teacher, you had to pray before every day. School started with prayer, and you had to say the Lord's Prayer, the King James Version with the doxology, and the 23rd Psalm. But Catholics were not allowed to pray the Hail Mary.
Wow.
Wow.
Right? That's how powerful the culture was.
Yeah.
We forget America was utterly a Protestant nation, utterly. And Catholics didn't come into the mainstream and into the middle class of the United States of America until right around the Kennedy influence in the 50s and 60s. And then as with Vatican II and so much other socio-economic turmoil that went on in the 60s and 70s, Catholics have emerged into the mainstream of America to the point now you really can't distinguish between Catholic and Protestant values for the most part in our country. But that's not how I grew up. I grew up in a very different context than that. The other thing is how the Catholic experience tied itself to the Democratic Party. And so in Rhode Island, other than for a couple years in the 50s, the Democratic Party has controlled both chambers of the Rhode Island legislature, the Senate and the House of Representatives, with somewhere around a 75% majority for 90 years. It is the most one-party state in the United States of America. And the average Rhode Islander doesn't have a clue about any of this.
I think
they're just utterly enculturated into it and doesn't understand that without opposition voice and competition, you don't have good ideas and you don't have good government. And
you don't really have a free society.
You don't have a free society. So my father, I grew up in rural Exeter, and my father was a town councilman. He was the director of athletics at the regional district, the school eventually. He was a small businessman. He was eventually a state representative. But at the height of his career as a politician, out of 100 members, there was only 15 Republicans in the House of Representatives.
Wow.
Right? And so I always viewed myself as a poor kid from Exeter who lived his life from a minority value position. Right? Which is an utterly different experience of a kid growing up in Warwick.
Sure.
Yeah.
In the 80s.
In the 80s, right. So just 10 or 15 years apart from our experience. So I'll cut that there, but
let's hear about your experience, Corey, and then growing up as a kid in the 80s. And then I want to double back to Mark in a second, because I also want to tie this to what we see presently as far as our dynamic for ministry. So while you answer that, we'll give Mark a second to think about the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm at a point in my life now. I just turned 44 a week ago. We have the same birthday.
Yeah.
By the way, right?
Birthday buddies.
Which I did not know. And you reach a point, usually around the 40s, where you become nostalgic for your childhood. And I think that's been going on probably for a few years now with me. I loved the 80s. I loved growing up in the 80s. And the movies were great. The television shows and the cartoons were great. The toys were great. Everything was awesome.
Right.
And
I'm nostalgic for the 80s.
Nothing wasn't great.
Nothing wasn't great in the 80s. The country sociopolitically was doing well. Not perfect, it never does. But, Reagan was president, of course. It wasn't perfect, of course, I readily admit, but it was great. Everybody was making money in the 80s. My family did very well in the 80s. My father works in real estate. I mean, we Christmases were big in the 80s, and then the 90s came around and things changed a little bit. Not just with Christmases, but also with movies and toys and everything else. Everything just started to stink, right? Yeah. But for my generation, it was without giving into overcharacterizations, it was the age of excess, right? And you had everything, but I also think in a weird sort of sense, it was the beginning of the absence of religious and spiritual life in our culture, right?
Yeah.
And it's that classic dictum where you see progress, too much progress ultimately will feed a certain measure of regress, right? Morally, ethically, because there is such a thing as having too much.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think as conservatives, sometimes we struggle with that. We like the idea of getting as much as possible and success, right? But I think we learned eventually that doesn't work. And so my generation, right, we're the Gen Xers, I guess. We're in this weird place, right? We're not, and forgive me We're not as idealistic or maybe even as a little delusional as the boomers are about the realities of the world. But at the same time, we're also not as clearly nuts as
Yeah.
to put it bluntly,
Yeah.
as your generation. Not that you're nuts, you stand out, of course, but so we're in this middle position of trying to figure out, well, what is the way forward? What is our contribution, generationally speaking? We're mid-agers now. We have kids who are getting older. Our kids are going into our teens. They'll be in college soon, right? I have a 17-year-old who's going to be going to college in a few years, maybe not. So what do we do, right? It's very strange. It's a strange thing. Because all three of us are so different.
Very different.
Yeah.
And it's consistent with other commentaries I've heard about Gen X. It's something of a forgotten generation.
We are, yeah. We're the generation that began to come of age at the tail end of the Cold War, right? You grew up in the midst of the Cold War.
Oh, absolutely.
And our own personal conversations where we have very different ways of looking at some of that, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that, of course, affects also even today how we think geopolitically about things, right? So it's so strange, and it's just such a challenge, right?
Yeah.
In a country that allows you to have all of these opinions, right?
Absolutely.
And none of them can ever be wrong. They're always right.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you hold them. So
That's a great way of putting it. One correction for you, Corey. I am definitely nuts. My wife can attest to that. I'm just behaving for the cameras right now.
you just don't destroy property.
Yeah. I draw the line at destruction of property. So, with that as context, and I'll get to myself last. But Mark, how do you see, from a baby boomer perspective, how everything that we just talked about, how does that fit into ministering to the baby boomer generation and the dynamic that we see within our own congregations? Big question.
It is a big question. Ministering at this point in my life, because I've been ministering to baby boomers my whole life, right? But there's been an evolution to that's just massive. I was training for ministry in the mid-'80s. I've been ordained for 30 years, and I've said to you during your training, it was, when I first became a priest, there was still a semblance of historical Christianity that was the foundational undercurrent of culture. And as boomers, and I'm being the youngest boomer, so as I aged from my 20s into my 30s and 40s and 50s, the boomers became further and further distanced from the value system of their parents, the greatest generation. And I think, to Corey's very important point, that they became overwhelmed with success.
Yeah.
Success being having a bunch of useless stuff that you don't need, and their goals were to retire at very young ages, and all of these things that left them spiritually poor. And so as I've aged and ministered to my generation and people older than me, I've realized how little they even know about the Christian faith. And that I've spent just an immense amount of energy in my life trying to catechize boomers and members of the greatest generation that were older than me just about the basic tenets of Christianity. The war, the generation after the war, America thrived in the 50s. It was the only superpower, and because the Cold War came up, but economically, it was by far the only superpower. And churches were full, but not because they were learning much of anything, but there was just this massive social expectation. If you were a middle-class American of decency, you went to church.
You don't sleep in on Sundays.
Right, you didn't sleep in on Sundays, and it was just part of the establishment. But the detrimental effect of that was, as we know, by the time the boomers were becoming parents, their kids were were being more and more disattached from Christianity and learning less and less about a Christianity. And every ensuing generation has less and less attachment to anything that even resembles historical Christianity.
Yeah.
And then so what's left of the greatest generation, there's very few of them left, and the boomers, some of them whom are 20 years older than me, they're like, what happened? I can't believe it. My kids don't believe this, my grandchildren don't believe that. They're playing a game with themselves.
Yeah, right.
They're fooling themselves.
You happened.
They didn't do the job. They didn't do the job.
Yeah.
Right? And this is the consequences
Yeah.
of it. When we lived in austerity, when you live in austerity, faith has a much more important role to play in your life because you don't have anything else to turn to.
Yeah.
Right? We have too much money. We have too easy of a lifestyle. And God's something we just occasionally, it's like the Bible on the coffee table, you occasionally blow off the dust off it and put it on your mantle when you need help.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, there's like a cycle, it's a picture, probably also a saying that gets circulated online. I'm sure Corey has seen this before. It starts with, great men make good times.
Yes.
Good times make soft men.
Yep.
Soft men make hard times.
Yeah.
And then hard times make great men.
Yeah. That's
And
where we're at.
That's where we're
Yeah,
at right
for
now,
sure.
the
Yep.
soft men inevitably making hard times coming. And I think that's a discussion for another day. But
We're going to be there the rest of my life.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, awesome. All right. So I think we're back. Some classic technological issues here. I know Mark really loves technology.
Oh,
So
yes.
we had to go off camera so Mark could tinker with it and tell us what to do. He's secretly a technological savant. So,
Oh my gosh.
but I think that was a good break just to get up and stretch the legs there. So we'll just jump back into what we were talking about before. As a reminder, it was our own backgrounds coming from different generations. We've discussed Mark's perspective as a baby boomer and that impact on doing ministry today. And Corey, you've described growing up as Gen X, and you were just getting into what ministry looks like to Gen X people and with Gen X. And you had just prompted us that, well, they don't even really go to church to begin
Right.
with.
Yes. They're that difficult generation where they're not there physically, but they're also not openly hostile to religious belief necessarily. Many would see the value in it in some sense, right? I mean, you engage them in conversation. But there's just not enough of the urgency, right, that comes with religious belief, right? Because even though, unlike the boomers, they were not the generation to first experience this upsurge in living in a comfortable society and having all these trimmings and whatnot in social life. They are the generation that was just born into it. And so when you live that level of comfort, right, and I look at 9/11 as sort of the metric for that, right? And you always ask the question, well, where were you on that day, right? And if you were my generation, you were in college, right? You're physically in college. That's where you were. That's where I was, I remember when it happened. I was in the library. And for us, it was the shock of our lives because it was a reminder to us that this is the way the world really is. These are the things that happen in the real world, right? The real world is not your comfort, right? It's not a place where everything is always peaceful. It's not a place where you get everything you want, right? The boomers could understand that to a certain degree because they grew up in the midst of the Cold War. For example, they lived through something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? They knew how close they had to come, right, to the end of all things. If they were born just after World War II, they understood what they were inheriting because many of their fathers did not come back from that war.
They went off to Korea.
Oh, and then they went off to Korea almost the next day, right? And so for my generation, all of that's just in a history book.
Yeah.
It's not a lived experience. 9/11 changed that.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to try and gauge where that generation is at. There's an understanding now of the way the world works, but at the same time, there's still that unfortunate attribute, I think, in the mind where, well, I'm still going to live forever, though, right? I may not live forever comfortably, but I am going to live forever, right? Mortality is just,
Yeah.
I read about that in books. It's not something I necessarily see all the time. And then I think with, your generation, it's more religion. What's that?
Yeah.
Right? So, oh, really? You go to places where you do that thing? Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Yeah, not for me.
Yeah, it is.
Right.
It's a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
I was doing physical therapy back when I was first diagnosed with Parkinson's, and a young lady, she was probably 30, and she says to me, "Well, what do you do for a living?" And I said, "Well," and I never tell them, I always use the word priest because I figure that's the most generic word they're going to, and she says, "What's that?"
Wow.
She had no idea.
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, I pastor a church." And just this blank look, and
Yeah.
she was a sweet young lady, but
You get paid to do that?
no clue, clearly. I mean, unchurched or just ignorant, unaware to that extent, which tells me her parents were that way. Right?
Yeah.
It's staggering.
And it's not a hostility.
It
No,
wasn't
it's
from
just,
her.
it's
It
just
wasn't
it's
from
a
her.
blissful, innocent ignorance.
Absolutely.
Right, yeah.
In a way, and I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit, but just to comment on that too, for myself being recently ordained and talking about it with friends and family, but especially peers and coworkers who are unchurched, you would expect that you would be met with resistance or hostility, as I'm sure you've experienced quite commonly in public. But I've found amongst the peers of my generation, they are so far removed from that experience of being churched or being at least tangentially related or familiar with the Christian experience that they also, many of them are in a sense removed from a lot of the common prejudices that have come up. And obviously those prejudices are there and will always be there, but I think especially for a certain kind of like the middle class millennial, those who are maybe more inclined to be critical thinkers and those who have been raised on really a well-meaning idea of tolerance, not the tolerance that is being thrown around for the sake of canceling people, but I'm just talking about genuinely well-meant love and tolerance. There is almost an openness and a curiosity to my vocation as an ordained minister that probably wouldn't have been there, say, for Generation X or perhaps early millennials, because we've now come so full circle that it's not, oh, I'm rebelling against my faith. It's my parents didn't really practice it at all. I haven't been raised in it, so I really don't know all that much about it. So I found that to be very interesting.
It's like a legend you read about.
Yeah.
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 It's just amazing, the differences between the three generations, right?
Right.
The experiences.
Yeah.
Even listen to you talk, right? So it'd be interesting to me, like Vietnam dominated me growing up. It didn't dominate you growing up.
No.
Right? It was already old history.
Very old. It seemed like forever ago when I was a kid.
Right.
I knew about it because I watched TV or I
Right.
watched documentaries with my father, and so. But for me, and I think that's always the case when you're a child. Everything seems far away, right? But for me, it's like, oh yeah, that was a long time ago. That was before cable.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Right. Right.
But it wasn't that long before
Right.
my generation, right? So
No.
it ended only a few years before I was born.
Yeah, I can remember being 6 or 7 years old. My aunt's husband was an E8 in Vietnam, and he was, these Time Life used to have these volumes they'd put out. There was
Sure.
pictures of him and his platoon
Yeah.
in the jungles and stuff, and so my aunt watching every night television for casualty counts was a big deal, right? And you can't transfer that anymore, right? It gets lost, and that's human. Just the human reality. From we can pretend we know about the greatest generation. We don't know anything about the greatest generation. We have
Most of them aren't even around anymore.
no. We
How do you meet one?
no. And how can you
Yeah.
really appreciate what they did?
Yeah. Right.
I think as a boomer, being just old enough where these guys were still in their 40s when I was growing up.
Yeah.
it was, I could have a sense of appreciation for what they did. But a millennial or a Zer, forget it. It's not going to be, I'm going to be sure they think what they did was noble.
Yeah, it's a very good possibility.
Or
Yeah.
just totally unaware, just doesn't enter our mindset. That's
Yeah.
why I'm always, being the weirdo that I am, drawn to those videos of the last of our greatest generation being awarded medals. I always share these with
Yeah,
Mark, where
yeah.
on the news you get some 105-year-old man. This was recently out in,
Yeah,
I think,
yeah.
Colorado, where
Amazing,
he
amazing.
wasn't given his, I don't know if it was a Purple Heart or a Silver Star, but due to some clerical error, he never received his award when he was discharged after World War II.
Wow.
And they just found him now. He and his daughter had been advocating for him to try and get him this award that he earned, and they finally came through, and he was given it at the age of 105.
Wow.
And so they caught that on a local news channel out there, and
Yeah.
the video made the rounds on the internet. But it's just the most wholesome thing, and it's also, again, that distinct cultural difference in the way that he talks about World War II and having lived through it. And especially what strikes me is the profile and courage and
Oh.
the frank nature with which he speaks about these dangerous
Yeah.
He went in,
encounters.
he disarmed and killed 4 Germans in a pillbox.
One of those was a guy who
Unbelievable.
he charged a pillbox and took
Yeah.
out the flamethrowers, and it was just all by himself, took out multitudes of, I think it was in Japan. So that guy you're thinking
Oh,
of, he
okay.
fought in the Pacific Theater.
Specifically, yeah.
But again, you don't encourage that nowadays.
Yeah.
But
Oh, we can't conceive of that.
No, it's interesting because, speaking of your generation, right, and how they interpret and receive that information, if they bother to interact with it, is that this is the generation that sees fascism and, totalitarianism everywhere, but they
Yes.
have no real acquaintance of it
No,
when it actually did really exist, and what a whole generation of Americans,
it's not so bad.
yeah,
did to get rid of it, essentially, and to curb its growth, and then so on. So, yeah, and that becomes a very difficult demographic to teach and to instruct, right? So,
I guess I'll go on for a little bit. I'll share my thoughts about it now, answering my own question here. So first, my experience being raised as a millennial, and I'm really more so on the back end of the millennial generation, although still solidly within it. So I was a young child in the 90s, and for us on the back end of the millennial generation, we are really the last ones to maybe grow up without internet in the home, or to grow up with dial-up. I still remember when we got our first computer and we hooked it up to dial-up internet, and you get the dial tone as you were logging on, and you remember this too.
Yes,
You
yes.
want to go and use the computer, you have to go yell at mom to get off the phone,
right.
and only one person could use it at a time. Also, to our earlier discussion, one of the last generations to remember a time before 9/11. So my brother Adam, who is our fearless producer and deserves all the credit here, is at the very end of that millennial generation, and after him we've got Generation Z, which would really be the group of people who would have no memory of 9/11, and even that is now falling into distant memory. And so for myself, I was 7 when 9/11 happened. And so I was in first grade. And so I don't remember really any details about it other than lockdowns at school, and not even being particularly afraid, I don't think, because we were so shielded from the information that was going on at the time. But it's still definitely a cultural hallmark for us. But for example, never flew before 9/11, so post 9/11 airport reality is one that I've always known.
Wow. I didn't think of that.
And there are so many interesting cultural touchstones like that now that define our experience. So I think for us, as part of the millennial generation, the financial crisis of 2008 is our most defining moment so far, especially for those who are older than me in this age bracket, because of course in 2008 I was still in junior high. So it didn't affect me individually as much, but of course it was difficult for us on a family level. My dad was laid off around that time, and we struggled to make ends meet in certain regards. And I think that's not just my case, but applies to virtually everyone else who lived during that time, and especially in the middle class. But I think when we look at how millennials behave now, those who were trying to get jobs at the time coming out of college and those who are just starting off in their careers, they really did, in many respects, get the short end of the stick, because they look at the generations previous to them. We were discussing the age of abundance that we went through in the 80s and in part in the 90s, and we wanted a piece of that pie for ourselves. And so now, facing this very, I would say, real economic reality that has been a part of the human experience, this idea of an economic crash, we didn't really know how to respond to that. And so there was some frustration there, and I think that frustration has really fed into a lot of the opinions and this experience of the system is bad, the system is rigged, because it benefited the boomers so much that you were able to buy your house for a nickel and a handful of cranberries, and now you're hard pressed to buy the same home for anything less than $300,000, $400,000, depending on what market you live in. So the economic reality, the financial crash of 2008 is another defining moment for us in our generation. And then I think another one is that we were raised, again, from parents who were either maybe not so much Gen X, mostly baby boomer parents who, again, were very accustomed and deep within this culture of doing what you want, when you want, always having plenty, and also not being challenged on your ideas. And we've been affectionately or unaffectionately called the participation trophy generation. And I think there's a lot of truth to that too, where now we get trophies for everything we do, and we don't really, or haven't appreciated that value of hard work, of hardship, building character and taking on that as a responsibility. And so that's continued to trickle down through the millennial generation and generations after, a sense of entitlement and a sense of not being able to question or challenge my beliefs, because my beliefs are who I am, and my emotions, my feelings are part of my identity. We've shifted very much toward an emotive mindset, emotive language. Right. And I think my generation is really the first to live through that and internalize that, where throughout school, for our entire experience, we've been inculcated with the idea that your feelings matter, your feelings are important, and that progresses to your feelings are who you are, they make up your identity. And so any attack on an idea or a viewpoint for a large swath of my generation and the population is an attack on you as a person. And then we can go down any sort of path with free speech being equated to violence and things of that nature. But I want to kind of stay on track here just again in terms of my own experience. So that's really what defines it for me. You've got the just barely pre-9/11, you've got the financial crisis of 2008, and then you've just got this, again, being the first generation to really grow up with computers and the internet. Right. You saw me and my brother a few minutes ago speaking Greek about the inputs and outputs of our recording setup, and that's just all been second nature to me.
And it's so interesting, because I parented your generation, right? So I'm a young parent going through 9/11, the crashes of the late, 2007 and 8 economically. Now Corey's parenting the generation younger than you. And this emotiveness gets deeper and deeper as every generation, right? So you're going to talk about Z as like, what's wrong with these kids? They don't know how hard it was being us, right?
Yeah.
And it's amazing, and it goes by like a zip.
Right. Yeah. My two youngest are 10 and 9, and it just seems like they were born just last week, right? And it's gone by so quickly. But I'm sure we'll discuss this in more detail, down the pike. But the response to a lot of that, being a parent now today of children under 18, that generation is to pull them back from this society, right? Chiefly the schools and so on, right? The developments that you're seeing in the schools, particularly the public schools. But and we don't know, and we also don't know what the effects of that are going to be in the long run. And also, I think what we neglected to mention, and this will be a whole other podcast, is the effects of the last 3 years.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh.
With the COVID hysteria and the paranoia and the lockdowns, which I would argue.
And the anti-Christian.
Well, that
veneer
aspect
the
of
whole
it,
thing.
right? And I would also argue too that the response to COVID, whatever it was, would not have been successful as it was with also not the preceding hysteria that came from 9/11 and how
Yeah.
we responded to that as well.
Yeah, and that
Well, absolutely.
reminds me of
Absolutely.
a point I was going to
Or
make there too.
2007 and 8.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So as a millennial, my culture, my generation is one that has been raised entirely under an ideology of safetyism.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And that stems initially from 9/11
Yep.
and thereafter that. To be safe is one of the highest moral goods and an absolute virtue, that if you are not safe, then in large respects, nothing else matters.
Right,
And
and safety is government intrusion into your life.
Yeah.
yes, because no one else can ensure your safety
Right.
as good
Right.
or as well as the experts who reside in government.
Right.
Government, and I think also, you could argue, corporate intrusion as well.
Oh,
Because
absolutely.
I think the last few years, we have seen just how closely these two entities work together in our society,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Try to untwine them is.
Yeah.
is,
and it's a long-standing issue.
yeah.
It's a long-standing issue, and, we can unpack that,
Yeah,
more down the road.
there are definitely many issues in the future that we'll be able to discuss, and I'll allude to a few of them here now, because thinking about the ministry challenges that I face with my generation, they are myriad. And I think I often speak not only of myself, but also looking ahead to what future ministry challenges that I will need to face decades on into my ministry, and really trying to anticipate that. And I think that's a big part of what I think will be the most stimulating discussion that we have, there are a lot of things that I can talk about that I think, no offense intended, will be totally alien to you both, but will be incredibly relevant
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
what doing ministry looks like. And we've made this a focus. I've made this a focus in large part with ministry in our own congregation too,
Right.
with sermons and with articles that I've written. But we've talked about it a little bit before, this idea that my generation, I think, in a large sense, is bifurcated depending on which socioeconomic strata you came from. For myself, going to the school district that I went to really was more of a private school atmosphere.
Absolutely.
And so there are still large pockets of people my age who were brought up and brought to church, especially in Rhode Island, nominally Catholic, going to church because it's the right thing to do, which I think, in comparison to others of the millennial generation, is kind of a byproduct of a bygone era. I think was probably more so previous generations doing that. So depending on who I talk to, I could either be speaking to a peer who is very familiar with the Christian experience, especially in Rhode Island. Many of my friends were brought up Catholic up through CCD and confirmation, and that's what you needed to do. You got confirmed, and then you were out because you were good. You're going to heaven, baby. So there's that familiarity with it. And then on the other hand, thinking of unchurched friends and peers that I know who, total opposite end of the spectrum, so unfamiliar with church that they don't even really have the same prejudices about it. I would almost say that the people who were brought up nominally Catholic or nominally Christian were the ones who maybe had a bad experience with it, or were taught an incomplete version of Christianity because of the attitude of their parents, and those were the ones who eventually rebelled against it and formed opinions about it and biases that are negatively affected.
Yeah.
So I think there's those two things going on when it comes to ministering to my generation. And then Generation Z and beyond leans much more toward totally unchurched. But I think there's a positive aspect to that too, where now there's an aspect of rediscovery. That they've been floating in the void for so long, being left to their own devices to define their own identities. And we'll have a lot to discuss about that as well, that you're just free floating in the wind, and, well, there's got to be something more out there. And that's where I see us with this podcast and the perspective we can provide, and also the perspective of the great traditions, to be able to come in and provide something far more substantive than feel-good cotton candy Christianity. You have the tradition of the undivided church, especially through the first 3 centuries. You have the magisterium, you have the mystery, and this connection throughout the chain of history that is much deeper than the individual Americanized Christianity that we've just discussed. So now it's no longer left up to you to define who you are. God defines who you are, in that you are first created in his image, and then when you receive Christ, are now adopted as a son or daughter. And that's where the identity comes from, that's where the responsibility comes from, and it includes a lively faith, which means there are requirements of you as a follower of Christ. It is not, well, I feel like I love Christ, and yeah, exactly. Who are you to tell me what to do? I love Jesus, and that's enough, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there is a big aspect of that where I think ministering, especially in Rhode Island, where there is a much greater dearth of literacy, biblical literacy, Christian literacy, the great traditions are going to be much more effective. Sacramental traditions will be much more effective because in time, it'll be a slow process, but that's ultimately what will endure because of the grace bestowed by the sacraments, and then the mystery of those, the bread and the wine, and especially that will call this next generation forward.
And it moves us, you're absolutely right, and we've talked about it, you and I, many times, is that it must move the church away from the cult of personality of the preacher, and that God's the star, Christ is the star every week.
You are not the star.
In the great liturgy, right? And that even, knowing you both for years, Corey, since he was a young man, it's like, we've said it many times, man, the Holy Spirit just wasn't here this week. As if the Holy Spirit, absents itself from divine worship at any point, right? Like, you can all of a sudden divide the Trinity into thirds or something, It's just a silliness in that the Holy Spirit's tied to music, particularly contemporary music, right? And it's just void of any logical theology and so forth. One of the things that always struck me all the years, and you've both heard me speak on it many times, and people used to get so upset with me. They go, everybody's a child of God. I go, no, they're not.
That's
No.
so.
No, they're not.
Yeah.
Everybody's made in the image of God because that's God's order of creation. You become a child of God by choice.
Right.
You're adopted and you're grafted into the family of God. Everybody's not a child of God.
Right.
The vast majority of people, overwhelmingly, in every congregation any of us have ever sat in, does not believe that, right?
Yeah.
And so you start from a wrong premise, right? A false premise right from the beginning. So your conversation with people is based on a falsity.
Right.
Everybody's not a child of God.
Yeah.
Right?
It's terrible theology.
It is.
Yes.
And so we have these tremendous challenges. I think a guy at my point, in the ministry, I don't have the answer, to be honest with you. I mean, when I was a young guy, I was the youngest rector in the Episcopal Diocese of Rhode Island. I was, I'm trying to say this without sounding like a total egomaniac, but I was the youngest rector. I was very successful in ministry, and I was in national leadership and all of this, and I assume it had to do with my acumen or maybe whatever, just being a crazy guy or whatever. And that fueled me and moved me, and it made you popular and influential and so forth. And but in my career, the church just evaporated. It just evaporated, right? And so much of my energy was people were drawn to me, and eventually the church that you guys belong to was because I was one of the only guys that would, in a sense, be standing for what once was historical Christianity,
Yeah.
right? And so for about a generation, we drew in Rhode Island several hundred people to our parish because we were just about it.
Mm-hmm.
But then people die and grow old, and as we know, barely any millennials came. Zia's were already, your generation was already out, and then now there's nobody.
Yeah.
Now there's nobody. So I see this with, Protestant minister friends and evangelical friends and priests in Orthodoxy and Catholicism and Anglicanism. We don't really know what to do,
Right.
right? Because in a sense, we're just caretakers to the last of the boomers in your generation who doesn't really care much about Christianity,
Yeah.
right? And so what we used our energy, our calling, we dedicated our life to for those first 20 years, it doesn't seem really all that relevant
Right.
to a lot of things, right? And as you and I have talked about it, the answer for the future isn't with me. Not that you cease to have priestly function and you preach the word of God and God's sacraments are efficacious. We must have new generations that speak to their time and place. So that means my generation and your generation, we have to concede those things to new generations, if they even emerge. Right? These people have to emerge. They're not going to emerge out of a vacuum.
Right.
They have to emerge out of a faith experience, out of faith community. Yeah. And I think my generation, your generation, they're just waiting to fall from the sky like snowflakes.
Yeah.
Right? No, we have to produce them.
Yeah.
A lively faith community produces men for ministry, masculine men for ministry.
Right. Yep.
And if we're thinking anything other, it's just foolishness. It's utter foolishness. Think about all the mainline churches you guys have known. Oh, we're looking for a new pastor. Good luck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? They live in total denial in fairyland about what's been going on for decade upon decade upon decade.
Yeah.
And
Or have been instrumental even in some cases
Right.
in producing it.
and there's
right?
there's no hope in those places.
Right.
There's no hope.
The way we've always done things is no longer effective, and that was the subject of my recent article, at least part of the apologia at the start of it, that we're basically churches that are rooted in this old way of doing things. They're using the wrong tool for the job. You're trying to harvest wheat by using a fishing net.
Yeah. It's
So I'll just speak to some of those challenges as part of what does ministry look like for millennials and beyond, Generation Z and even Generation Alpha after that, although I'm
Is that
really
what it
no
is?
expert. Yeah, that's
I'm
what I've heard.
learning things all the time.
I've heard it's Alpha after
Starts all
Z.
over again.
And we had this discussion, where did the Zoomers fall? So I always thought that Zoomers were just Generation Z, but I could be wrong about that. It could be more of a blanket term for Zoomers and Alpha, really just
Yeah.
raised now,
Does
coming
does
of
God
age.
come up with these terms? Does God reveal these terms through a prophet or something?
He does.
Okay.
In dreams especially. That's where I get most of my material.
Just wondering.
Yeah.
Okay.
God speaks to me personally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
His nickname is Pew. Pew Research comes up
Yeah.
with all.
So one thing that comes to mind first is our attitude. Maybe attitude is the wrong word. We're depressed. We're overdosing. That's not just millennials, but we have higher rates of depression and suicidality, and those go up and up with successive generations because we're unmoored, we're untethered from any sort of institutions or structures or responsibility. So that's one part of the context that we're ministering into, and we need to tailor our ministry to show what a life tethered to those things look like. And so what I say so often is, Mark, you mentioned that you don't have the answers, and certainly none of us really have a perfect answer, but one thing that we do know is that the fundamentals of evangelism haven't changed, that we are being called to go forth and make disciples, and it's really the twist, the flavor of it that is going to change. And so the formula, if you will, of going out, lively faith, there it is again, and living lives that are distinct from the cultural milieu and living lives that are consistent with a Christian moral, social, sexual ethic. This will make us look very distinct, but also our joy will shine forth and make it evident to people that maybe this is something worth following. And then that opens the doors for us to have these conversations where the apologetics are then tailored to the individual. So you've got the depressive aspect on the one end that, again, we are sad and we don't understand why. Well, we know that Christ can speak to that. There's another aspect of being absent of community, and you hear the term metaverse and virtual reality being thrown around a lot. Now, one thing that I don't hear discussed very often is the idea that the metaverse and virtual reality are not necessarily the image of putting on a helmet and hanging out with Mark Zuckerberg that people think. And it's debatable as to whether that form of media will actually be successful, because I think we are still incarnational beings, and so people still have an innate instinct, I think, to be tied to the real world. But my generation, Generation Z, even more so, are now living lives that are almost entirely virtual. You think of the accessibility of the streaming equipment that we have here today, that is tied in large part because rather than in-person incarnated communities, people are forming communities online, living in Slack channels and discussion groups and using words and names of things that you don't even understand.
Yeah,
Mark.
I don't even know what a Slack channel is.
But you're forming communities.
You're old, man.
We're talking about, it's not even quite social networking. And even I struggle with the words to describe it, but it's online communities, for the lack of a better term.
Right.
And now you're able to find communities around all these niche interests that you have, whether it's gaming or a form of entertainment or cooking, you name it. You can go on to Reddit and find an infinitely long thread of people discussing very, very particular interests, and you fit right in.
Wow.
Yep.
And
it reinforces everything about your life.
It reinforces everything about your life, and all of a sudden, your online virtual avatar, who you put forward as yourself and your identity into the virtual world, supersedes your in-person, incarnate reality.
The real you.
The real you, exactly. And so that is where I think the biggest disconnect that the baby boomers, Gen X, in Christian ministry doesn't even perceive.
Right.
And so when we talk about especially a post-COVID reality for ministry, we are going to constantly be calling people back into the glories of community and communion with one another and centered around the Eucharist. And one final point on that too is we think that the ministry of the great traditions, Eucharistic traditions, will be understandably more effective in the long run because the Eucharist reminds us of the reality that we serve a Lord who is also incarnate. And it calls us back to that it's no longer just an idea floating around in the metaverse, that we actually serve a God who entered into space, time, and reality.
Right.
And then it ties everything else together that we've just been talking about, that you don't get that with individualized, Americanized Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, incarnation is everything.
Yeah.
Right? God came into time and space. It's the whole Christian story, right? It's the greatest story ever told, ever lived. It's the greatest reality of the history of history.
Yeah.
And it's utterly disconnected. I've said this, my wife's family is all of evangelical stock, right? There's my father-in-law's a minister. Both her grandparents were ministers. Her brother's a minister. Her brother-in-law's a minister. And whether we know it or not, we're so influenced by Benedictine incarnational theology in the West, right? That it dominates, undergirds, at least Anglican and to a large extent Roman Catholicism, right? The incarnation dominates our theology. It does not dominate Reformed Protestant theology, right? Oh. And therefore, the evangelical free church experience, it doesn't dominate that stuff, right? So it's not sacramental.
Right.
It's not this idea that God's with you.
Yeah.
God, as we say, God dwells in us and we in him. We ingest God.
Exactly.
Right? We ingest him when we gain supernatural strength that allows us to do mighty things for God.
Yes.
That's the key to revival and everything, renewal, everything, is the Eucharist. And I would say to our evangelical brethren, they say it's about the Word. I go, yes, it's about the incarnate Word, who feeds us, who is literally present in his church and in his sacraments, right? And as opposed to somebody's opinion.
Yeah.
Right? Somebody lecturing at me for an hour a week. It's like, that's nice, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot there, but I think the common themes of what we'll be talking about in the future revolve around the Eucharist. They revolve around community and identity, and how my generation and successive generations struggle with those things.
Yeah.
But do you guys have any questions about that in terms of ministering to millennials or Generation Z, or maybe it's really just something to process?
Well, I'm definitely just working with you. I'm marveling at what God's done in my life in the last 5 years. So when you started your process towards ministry, I'm like, well, I'm the wise sage who's going to teach him all about how to be a good priest, right? As it turns out, I've learned, I helped him a lot with biblical studies and history and, systematic theology. But Nathan's taught me, most of reality of the world that I literally did not live in for the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And it's been a very humbling and positive experience for me, is that, gosh, I have so much to learn. And if I'm going to be effective outside of a peer group that's been listening to me for 30 years, I have to change.
Right.
Simple as that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. somewhat in the same position, but there's also been a conscious effort on my part over the last few years to step away from a lot of that stuff, and in doing so, inadvertently just almost rendering myself deliberately ignorant, right? Partly out of frustration, because there are no real answers to these questions.
Yeah.
Right? I used to think that there possibly were, but there's too many questions.
Yeah.
Too many questions, on how to address these things, right? As how it relates to churches and the culture. So, yeah.
It all goes back to what you were saying, Nathan. I can't fathom not living an incarnational life in community. As it is, our lives are so distorted, and they're jagged. And without the Christian family gathering on the Sabbath, I don't think I'd make it. I just wouldn't make it.
Right.
It's the balm of Gilead to gather with the believers on Sunday. As small as the group is, or as large as the group is.
Right.
And what we're going to be, we know this, we've talked about it, we are the remnant people.
Yeah.
And, at almost 59, however God's going to use me, I realize a big church in Rhode Island is going to be 100 people.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
and most of them are going to be a dozen to 25 to 30 people. And the older boomers, they don't get it. They're not going to be alive, right? And I'm going to age into my 60s and 70s, and your generation is going to be in their 50s and 60s and realizing, yeah, the church I grew up in the 500, they don't exist anymore. This is the church.
Yeah.
And this is how we're called to live in joy, right? In power, in confidence, in hope. And by living a lively faith, we'll drop seeds that eventually will land in fertile soil.
Yeah.
We just got to trust God with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to be talking about all the time.
Yeah.
Right.
If there is any one answer, it is that.
Yeah.
And we just have to awaken from our slumber and go forth and live our lives with a lively faith, whatever that looks like for each of us individually, because it will be different. And we're constantly trying to awaken our fellow Christians to that reality, because we've fallen into a malaise because we're overwhelmed by all of the questions that we
Yeah.
think we need answers to.
We are. And, and we're going to travel light. We're not going to do it willingly, right? The buildings are going to go away, right? You can't maintain these buildings. People are money, right? And that the essence of what Christianity is about is going to reemerge in this new reformation that God's going to bring about for the whole universal church, right?
I've
So
said,
in 100 years, the church won't look anything like we
No.
think it should look like. It's going to look like what God wants it to look like, so that it can be effective to bringing people to salvation,
right.
right?
I've said time and again that not that denominational differences are unimportant, but especially I've seen from my peers and beyond, they are increasingly less important when talking about Christian fellowship, where as the culture around us puts up more resistance and hostility to authentic biblical Christianity and patristic Christianity, those of us who claim to cling to the one true faith once delivered to the saints will naturally gravitate toward each other. And I think that's part of what I think we can demonstrate through our discussions here, a couple of Anglicans and an Orthodox brother.
Yeah, that's got to be, what Christ says in John 17 is true, right? God wants us to be one, right? So God's plan is to eventually have the church one, right? We've been in division. There's always division, but the major division since 1054, and then just the ridiculous splintering of Protestantism into every possible group and heresy and everything else, right? Is that the point of the church is to be one. And in God's providence, that's where he wants the church to go, right? And that's going to take humility and faith and prayer of generation upon generation, right? Church has been divided at least between East and West for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Right? So we're not going to live to see it, but we have to be part of the process.
Yes.
We're called to be part of the process, and that takes humility. Like, we all don't know everything.
Right.
Right? In fact, the longer I live, I realize I don't really know much about anything. I don't know about you guys, but, it's like,
Adam, can we get a time check? Where are we right now?
This is at 48 minutes, and the first half was also 48 minutes. So.
Perfect. So I think this is a good time for us to take a break. We get up and stretch our legs and do what we need to do, and we'll finish this conversation later.